Hello, this is Miss Dagenford, and I wanted to go over a short description of the physiology of the respiratory system, the conducting zone, the alveoli, and then some of the chemistry that's involved in it as well. So, we were going over a lot of the anatomy. Now let's talk about how some of these things work. So, some of the more obvious ones, we have our nasal cavity, which is going to warm and moisten the air through these folds that actually are bony folds covered by mucous membrane. And as the air passes over these, it warms and moistens that air. We have this soft, fleshy, soft palate in the back, and you might recognize that little thing that dangles back in your throat. That's called the uvula. When you swallow, that rises and gets pushed back against the back of the throat, and that's preventing items from getting up there. And then as you swallow, the epiglottis, which is a little harder, it's made of cartilage, it gets pushed up against the tracheal opening, and that prevents things from getting down into the trachea. And then we have the common area, the pharynx, which is the shared area for the digestive, for the foods that get down into the esophagus or the air that gets down into the trachea. When we look at the esophagus and the trachea, we can really see some differences. Now, this picture is pretty important. I get a lot of students mixing up the esophagus and trachea. Down here, this is the front of the body, and this is the trachea. And then up on top, that's the cross-section of the esophagus. Notice the color difference. The blue is indicating cartilage. So the trachea needs to stay nice and open. It's an airway, so air is able to pass through it, whereas the esophagus is muscular, it's soft, and it's going to allow food to be swallowed and pushed down into the stomach. The C-shaped cartilage rings means that the back of the trachea is soft, and that allows for the esophagus to expand a little bit into this space. Not into the trachea, mind you, but it pushes up against the wall of that soft tissue of the trachea. The trachea is covered with cilia, and then the cilia is covered by mucus. So anything that's coming down and getting trapped in that mucus, the idea is the cilia is pushing everything back up, and then we can dispose of it multiple different ways. But it's to clean. And as we get to the entire system, we see differences in the anatomy. We start with the bronchus that splits off from the trachea, and it's made of fairly consistent cartilage rings. But you'll notice the blue here, which is the cartilage, it starts diminishing. It starts getting smaller and smaller. So we start with a lot of cartilage, we end with less cartilage, and we get to more muscle here. The tinier and tinier the tubes are. And then we end with the alveoli. And the alveoli are really tiny, thin, grape-like structures that increase the surface area tremendously. It's been estimated, but different books have different comparisons, that the surface area can be, between both lungs, can be the equivalent of a tennis court. I've heard a little smaller, but the point is it's rather large. And you can see by a simple comparison, if we only had one layer where we can absorb things, that would be pretty inefficient. The more we fold the membrane, the more surface area we get. So you can imagine once we're at these very, very tiny grape-like structures, we're getting multiple areas by which we can absorb oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. You throw the capillaries in there, and they're also increasing the surface area. So let's just wrap up kind of the comparison here. As we start with the trachea, and then we end with the alveoli. So I'm highlighting the differences there. As we start with the trachea, my highlight's a little bit skewed there. As we start with the trachea, we have C-shaped cartilage, less muscle, and then pseudostratified tissue with the cilia. As it transgresses down to the alveoli, we're going to get no cartilage, more muscle, and then, of course, eventually just a simple squamous. That means that we end up having a very vulnerable area because you can see from this picture, look at how thin these tissues are. These are not only one layer thick, but it's simple squamous, very thin. And there's no cilia. So down here, we're going to want macrophages, and the macrophages are going to help with the sorry about that. The macrophages are going to help because they're going to be crawling around and eating whatever they don't recognize. The little red things here are the capillaries, and the capillaries, they're kind of in cross section here. So you would see the capillaries kind of wrap around the alveoli, kind of like this. And that's going to then help absorb the oxygen. Together with the capillary membrane, we have what's called the respiratory membrane. The alveoli membrane, very thin. The capillary membrane, very thin, both simple squamous. And so we can absorb oxygen into our red blood cells, get rid of carbon dioxide into the alveoli membrane. Anything that compromises that, whether or not the tissue gets thicker or the alveoli start to break down, well, then you're going to affect how well we can absorb oxygen. Now, we get into one last picture, which I like because it does kind of put everything together. We're going to have our pulmonary arteries, which go down to arterioles, which go down to the pulmonary capillaries. And as they're coming to the alveoli, they're oxygen poor. And then as they divide and divide and divide and divide and branch into those capillaries, they're going to absorb the oxygen. And you can see that changing from blue to red. Nice symbolic to becoming oxygenated. So you're going to see this coming from the heart, and then as it wraps around, it's going to pick up the oxygen and go back to the left side. We just wrapped up the heart, the cardiovascular. Now you can see everything getting put together here. Now, we're going to skip this section. Now, there's something really interesting about those alveoli, though, and it has to do with the fact that it is coated with water molecules. We're made of, we have water inside of us, coating inside of our linings, and so here's our alveoli, and we want to imagine for a second that that's all we see is water. So here's my water droplets. And I'm going to pick this one right in the center, staring at us. And this alveoli with the water molecules. And I'm just going to do a cross-section, a two-dimensional, but of course this is a three-dimensional spherical area. And what you want to remember about water is very polar. And what it does is it has those hydrogen bonds between them. And so here's two water molecules, and they are getting attracted between the positive and negative partial charges that water has. So what this is going to do, these water molecules are going to be attracted to each other, and they're going to pull on each other. And because water is also going to be attracted to the alveolar membrane, what can happen, and I'm doing this I'm going to redraw this one as if it's happening. With only the water molecules start pulling on the alveolar membrane, and you can either have wholesale crumpling of the alveoli, or it's just going to be very hard to inflate the alveoli. And what will happen is the water molecules just collapse the alveoli. This is the respiratory distress. Now, the most obviously, we're concerned about it in all times of life, but what we're really concerned with is as a premature infant. So we're really concerned because during preemies, and we're talking about preemies, maybe 7 months, somewhere around there, premature infants, they only have this water, and they don't have something that mature infants have. So let's talk about what we should have. So this would be preemies. And this would be why it happens. Water molecules are attracted to each other. Now, what should we have? Well, let's go back to our water molecules. We want to prevent our water molecules from being attracted to each other. Well, what we do as adults and a mature like not a premature but a full-term infant, what it does is it creates this molecule or set of molecules, and those molecules act like a detergent. and not like a foaming detergent, but a detergent that pulls apart water molecules. And this is called a surfactant. And a surfactant basically reduces the water tension, the surface tension of the alveoli. So instead of the middle one, so this is without surfactants, which everything starts pulling in, pulling in, pulling in, and you get something that looks like the one on the right. And that would be disastrous, right? We're having something that's holding the alveoli in, and you can't inflate it. Well, if you put surfactant in, so this would be full-term infants, full-term babies. If you have that surfactant, then that disrupts the polarity, and the water molecules are not pulling on each other. And when you breathe in, you can really nicely inflate those alveoli, because now the water is not interfering with that. It's reducing that surface tension. So surfactant ends up being extraordinarily important because once we understood it, now we can treat these premature babies that don't have it. And so that's one of the first things that they can do is actually have this nebulizer for the preemies that have the surfactant. The surfactant is going to coat these alveoli walls that disrupt the water, and then the baby can inflate these alveoli, and you get this nice plump alveoli that then allows the lungs to be inhaling. You saw this section in class today. These were the X-rays of the preemies that were without the surfactant, and then after the inhaling. And you can see this arrow here is indicating all of this lovely dark, dark, dark area, which is meaning that that baby is getting oxygen. So I hope that helps catch you up. And we will talk tomorrow. Have a nice night.